Hello YouTube. Of all the continents in the Elder Scrolls universe, there is one that many would call the most legendary and most mysterious, the continent of Aldmuris. More so than even Akavir and Yokuda. Now, some claim that this ancient continent, which was once home to the ancestors of all the elven races, is just legend and has never existed at all, which is why today I'll be talking about Altmuris. So, let's roll the intro and let's get into it. So, Aldmeris, legendary birthplace of elven society, the place where the ancestors of all elves are said to have lived before they journeyed to Tamriel and evolved into the modern races. Now, before we explore what we know of the continent, there is something important that you need to know about it, specifically that there is some doubt over whether Aldmeris ever truly existed or not. You see, while most sources describe Aldmeris as a physical place that once existed, others claim that it never even existed, and the concept of Aldmeris is simply vague collective memories of creation and the dawn of time that the elven races try to make sense of. While then some other people even claim that Altmuris is simply a semi-religious place intentionally fabricated by the High Elves to have a symbol of national identity that in truth never existed and that people forget was made up. Now, the truth of the matter is that we don't know what the truth is, although near the end of this video I will go into these different theories a bit and explain them a bit more. But I thought it would be a good idea to tell you this up front so you can view this video from different angles and make your own conclusions. Because in the end the Elder Scrolls universe is full of unreliable narrators and that's why we have no idea what the truth is. So with that out of the way, Altmuris. Like I said, it's the continent where the very first elves, the Aldmer with a D, used to live. They were the progenitor race of elf to all other races of elf that we see on Tamriel currently, who evolved from this common ancestor, with only the left-handed elves of Yokuda possibly not evolving from them. Altmuris was the homeland of these progenitor elves, the Aldmer, a continent which is described by modern Tamrielic historians as a place of unrivaled beauty, but almost completely devoid of any nature. It is said that the entire continent was covered by an endless city that was millennia old and spread from shore to shore. The city was ancient and beautiful, having been built on top of itself endlessly over the ages. It's said that almost no natural green was left, although we know that some plant life still existed there in the form of trees, and I assume places like vineyards, farms and gardens. But all of this nature was all regulated and planned by those who lived there and built the continent, so there was no wild nature left anywhere. Now, very little is known about life on Altmuris, and that which is known are basically just remnants that survived from ancient Altmeri poetry and millennia-old tapestries and paintings still kept in the Crystal Tower. Now, we have seen one such depiction on an ancient painting, which some High Elf historians say was probably brought from Altmuris or painted just after the exodus from Altmuris. And in it we see an endless city, which also holds floating spires, towers and buildings among the clouds. While some historians claim that this painting is simply a fabrication, elves who look at it actually say that they get a strange sense of familiarity and a sense of home deep in their being, without even knowing what exactly the painting is or is supposed to depict, meaning that even if the painting is fake, or if Altmuris never existed, it's very close to how the elves at least remember Altmuris or the idea of Altmuris. Another strange collective memory that the elves have brought from Altmuris is that the sun there used to shine in an even more majestic way, which may have simply been how the sun was like in the very earliest times, but it may also indicate how Altmuris might not have fully been inside the mortal plane, but more on that later. Now, there is very little that we know of Altmeri society on Altmuris, other than that it was a place of high culture and sophistication. They had intricate art, complicated and near magical music, and we know that they worshipped their ancestors, with death itself playing a pretty big role in their culture. It also seems that they already worshipped some version of the current High Elven pantheon, as some of their earliest temples that the settlers of Tamriel built after their exodus from Altmuris were to the deities Anu, Magnus, Sirabane, Ifre, Trinimek, Xarxes, Mara and Standar. By now you may have noticed some similarities to the Altmer, so High Elf society, and if you did, you would be correct, because the High Elf, so the Altmer, so with a T, constantly try to preserve and replicate the culture of their ancestors, the Aldmer, so with a D, the common progenitor race. Meaning that many see Altmer culture as a bit of a blueprint for Aldmeri culture on Altmuris, as we for example see some of the same noble titles and same types of ancestor worship in High Elf culture. However, I do try to be a bit careful with that, as the High Elves have a bit of an obsession with trying to replicate their ancestors' culture, meaning that while some parts may have been forgotten, other parts may be needlessly exaggerated. Think about it like this: if you want to be like your great-great-great-great-great-grandparent and you heard that they drank jasmine tea, for example, you may start drinking jasmine tea yourself almost every day to replicate them, while in truth they might have only done so once a week. So because you don't know critical information of how often they drank it, you simply exaggerate what it really was. So that's why I'm a bit careful with directly copying High Elf culture onto Aldmer culture, because we may see this in them where they have amplified and exaggerated things a bit too far. So keep that in mind when people claim that it's the same culture. Now, there is one concrete legend that we know of life on Altmuris, and that's about a rebellion that took place on the continent. You see, back on Altmuris there was one very rich and influential nobleman named Orgnum. He used his riches to finance a rebellion against the rulers of Altmuris, leading to a civil war of sorts on the continent. However, this rebellion seems to have failed, and he and his followers were then put on ships and sent away from Altmuris, banned from ever returning to the continent. The Altmer on the continent then rose up a magical, impenetrable mist all around the continent of Altmuris, which prevented any of the exiles to ever return to Altmuris. These exiled Altmer would eventually land on the southern continent of Pianine, and they would evolve into the Marmer or Sea Elves, who we talked about recently. Link in the description if you want to know more about them. And they would never be able to set foot on Altmuris ever again and bother their brethren. Now, what's interesting here is that, as I talked about in my video on the Sea Elves, Orgnum is still very much alive and ruling the Marmer deep into the Third Era and presumably even beyond, as he is described as a very powerful deathless wizard, with some even claiming him to be an actual god, and as such he is the only one in modern day Tamriel that we know of who could still have memories of what Altmuris was actually like from eons ago when he and his original followers were banished, which is very, very interesting. It's just a bit of a shame that he isn't readily available for interviews and would likely change the truth in his favor, since he's been attacking the Somerset Isles in revenge of his and his people's exile ever since. Anyway, at some point during the early Meredith era, the Aldmer on the continent foresaw some strange and unspecified doom which was heading for Altmuris. Something was threatening the continent, and so some Aldmer made the decision to try and find a new homeland, as this threat was so severe that staying on Altmuris was apparently no longer an option. These elves sailed out in all directions, and one large group of Aldmer under the Altmeri High Lord Torinan landed on Auridon, one of the isles in the Somerset Isles, where they vowed to build a new homeland for themselves in the image of Altmuris. Now, these early Altmeri colonists would battle against the untamed wilds of the Somerset Isles and use the wood of their ships to build their initial homes and trinkets. The Aldmer of these days had to fight hard battles against the legendary wildlife of the Somerset Isles, which was then untamed and dangerous. But after many years they had become the top dogs on the Isles and founded an all-new civilization that would eventually grow into High Elf civilization. However, once they were established, they were very curious to find out what actually happened to those who stayed behind on Altmuris, and they wanted to see if they could go back and establish contact. So, 3 ships were sent out, all in different directions, to see if they could find Altmuris back, as during the Exodus they seemed to have forgotten the route they took to get to Tamriel. However, those 3 ships, of them only one returned, and that one was called the Niben, of whom Topol the pilot had been the captain. That ship had not found Aldmeris, but it had found Tamriel, an even bigger continent to the northeast of their new homeland of the Somerset Isles. That discovery eventually led to many groups of Aldmer going to the new continent to colonize it, and slowly but surely, these groups would evolve away from their cousins on the Somerset Isles, and they would become the different races of elf that we find in the games. The Bosmer, the Aeliots, the Chimer and the Direni, and the Chimer of course evolved into the Dunmer. But of those ships, no one ever heard back. Those 2 that are lost at sea, they seem to truly be lost, just like Altmuris. Some say that the continent may still be out there, lost to those who tried to find it, but a paradise to those who still live there. Yet others say that the continent was destroyed by the wrath of the gods, and some even claim that the continent has been transported out of the mortal realm, if it ever even was in the mortal realm, waiting to come back when all races of elf have been reunited. Altmuris as such has spawned many legends, and it is or was definitely a wonderful place from what we heard of it in descriptions. Now, as I said at the very start of this video, some therefore doubt whether or not it has actually even existed. Some say that in the chaos of creation in the Dawn era and over the course of the Elmo-Fae Wars, which were conflicts between the progenitor races of even the Altmer, so the ones that came before that, and the very earliest creatures that would later evolve into the humans, Those wars had so much magical power at the dawn of time that they shattered all of Nirn, and that the original homeland of the Elvish ancestors was already destroyed because of these wars, and that what we see of Altmuris are simply scattered half-rememberings of that time, before even the Alnofey wars. And yet others say that Altmuris was the place that was given to the ancestors of the elves as a reward by the god Auriel for helping him during creation in his battles against Lorkhan and his forces, and that Aldmeris was therefore a real place. And again others theorize that Tamriel was the elves' original home, and that it was then magically destroyed or changed, then leading to the founding of Aldmeris, or perhaps Tamriel before the magical Alnofey wars which destroyed it was Aldmeris, or something else happened to Tamriel that transformed it from Aldmeris to what we see today. And then what happened before then on Tamriel is what the elves half remember. And then of course there are those who say that Altmuris is simply a construct made out of cultural aspirations, a symbol of cultural identity of what the Altmer should strive to be, instead of a place that actually existed, when people by now then simply forgot that we once made it up, if that made sense. Now, what's the truth between all these theories? We honestly just don't know. I personally think that the truth is somewhere in the middle, because I think that Aldmeris was a real place simply because all the other destroyed or sunken continents of the other races, so think about Yakuda and Atmora, are places that really existed, as people visited the remnants of them in modern Tamrielic times and literally found proof of their history. So it isn't too much of a stretch to think that this continent also existed. But one theory that I haven't seen mentioned almost anywhere online, my own theory, is that even if it was a real place, it likely wasn't the exact big city that the memories describe it. Like, for example, like I said before, there likely was some nature, although it is likely that it was probably, heavily regulated by those living there. That being said, the reason that I really think that this was an actual place is that we literally have a given in-universe explanation as to why Altmuris is lost to those who have left it. And for that explanation, we need to take a look again at the civil war on the continent, or the rebellion that banished the Sea Elves. Like I said, at the end of Orgrim's rebellion, he and his followers were put on ships and forcibly exiled. The continent was then surrounded with a magical mist that would prevent them from ever finding it back, so that they could no longer bother the Altmer ever again. Now, you could probably see where I'm going with this, because I think that this mist has simply never been lifted, meaning that the Altmer who left later, even though they left not because they had problems with those on the continent, but they left because they were afraid of some weird doom, they also had to pass this mist, and thus likely were also prevented by it from ever finding the continent back. I mean, the one painting that we have of Aldmeris shows a city behind or in the clouds, but what if these are not clouds, but are the magical mists in front of Aldmeris, painted by those who left it, knowing that once the towers disappeared behind the mist, they would never again be able to find it back and lay eyes on the city again. This means that whatever's happening or has happened on Altmuris, again if it's a real place, we will never find out. Something that the elves that still live there live in some sort of paradise, unbothered, happy, cultured. Others think that whatever lies in the beyond, be it Altmuris or the patch of sea where it used to be, the ancient doom got a hold of it and the place is now completely devoid of life, perhaps only with some ruins of a once great city there. Whatever it is, I personally doubt that we'll ever know the truth of it. But that's about all I could say about Aldmeris, and I genuinely hope that I taught you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today, and that you enjoyed this video. And if you did, why not give the video a like, as that's the way to let YouTube know that this content is worthy, and that their algorithm should pick it up. Anyway, all that's left for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon supporters, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Doji, Hunter Joe, KLegendM, King Chris 20, RB Dash, Volkir of Argonia, Devin Mattingly, Rakai and Sword of Bushido. These people, along with all the others on screen, keep my channel afloat, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I will see you all in the next Elder Scrolls lore video, probably next week,